Hey class, welcome back. We're going to go through what we did in the notes today, what we did in class today. We covered a lot of ground, and that's because, of course, we don't have quite as much class time as we used to with the online learning. So I want to give you an opportunity to have a video where you can pause it, go back on a concept, check out what we did, and really understand where we've been and where we're going, as I like to say. So if you check it out, we start with a brain pop. Now the brain pop today was a little bit longer than the usual brain pop. Usually those are about the Tim and Moby shows that we watch. Usually they're about 4 or 5 minutes long. This one was like 6.5 minutes, which is pretty long for those guys, and it's because they were covering DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. But DNA is the short name for it, of course, the molecule of life, as it's been called. And the other day we were talking a little bit about viruses. And remember, viruses are those virus particles that contain a little bit of RNA or DNA, and they go in and they can rewrite a person's DNA. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Viruses, COVID-19, the things we were talking about with current events are a good way to kind of get a concept of what's going on here with DNA. One of the notes I put up on the board already, and I asked students, of course, to get 2 more of their own from the Tim and Moby, was that DNA is this double helix shape. Now, there's a great book called The Double Helix, as a matter of fact. But if you check out DNA, double helix, it's a fancy way of saying spiral. This particular shape was first figured out with X-ray technique by Rosalind Franklin. She did not, unfortunately, get the Nobel Prize for her work. That went to a couple other gentlemen that got the Nobel Prize when they figured out the spiral structure of DNA. But we now know that this particularly long molecule is what writes the code for life. Now, we've had molecules in class already. We start off with, hey, where did atoms come from? And hey, atoms get together to make molecules. We talked about, for example, the water molecule, H2O, 2 hydrogens stuck to 1 oxygen. We talked about, for example, the carbon dioxide molecule, 2 oxygens stuck to 1 carbon. Methane, 4 hydrogens stuck to 1 carbon. When you start talking about DNA, you're talking about a molecule that is so long that if you took it from one of your cells and stretched it out, one of your cells that has DNA, most do, and stretched it on out, it would be just about your height. So that's a very, very long molecule when you consider that a single atom, a single average sized atom, will basically take about 10 million of them to cross the length of one single human hair. So they are extraordinarily long molecules. We moved on from there to the basics, the most important part of the day. I would say if there's one major concept to get today, I used to always go for my one concept a day talk, this would definitely be it. There are 4 bases or parts to the DNA molecule. Later on, I will ask you, much later in the trimester, to remember what the A, T, C, and G stands for. It's the chemicals that are part of the molecule that make the DNA molecule. Adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. However, for now, just remembering A, T, C, and G is totally fine. And if you look at my very bad picture right here, if I were to take out a DNA piece and stretch it flat, there is one rule above all others that I'd like you to remember for the DNA. Remember, I don't ask you to commit too much to memory. We want to get the concepts, but there are definitely some things you want to commit to memory too. And that is this, that the A and T, the adenine and the thymine, they always join together. In other words, A's cannot combine with C's, A's cannot combine with G's. A and T are base pairs that always stick together. Same with C's and G's. The rule is for DNA that A's and T's stick, C's and G's stick. So if you were to show a big, long piece of the DNA molecule, every time you knew what was on one side, say for example, A, T, oh, I've got a G, I've got a C, you know exactly what's on the other side. Oh, if this is an A, this is going to be a T. If this is a T, this is going to be an A. You know all the way down the line what is on the other side. If you imagine this like a ladder, you know what's on the other side, so long as you know one side of this DNA ladder. That's incredibly important when we talk a little bit about, okay, the information that is in the DNA. That's great that you've got all this information, but how do you get that out to the rest of the cell? That's going to be very, very important, this pairing up that we're talking about. We also talked a little bit about this analogy, which the Tim and Moby also used, which Bill Nye also used. And I'm sure that they probably stole it from someone else as well because it's a good analogy. if you're speaking English, like we are right here, you've got 26 letters in our alphabet. Those 26 letters get together to make every single word that you could think of and all the ones you haven't even thought of yet. The point is this. We have 26 letters with which to make words. DNA has these 4. And this rule that it has to follow, where the A, T's, and C's, and G's have to go together. In other words, that's one reason why the DNA molecule is so long. It's so incredibly long. Because with these 4 letters, it has all of the instructions on how to make you, how to make every living creature. Remember, cells are the basic unit of life. Cells have DNA, and the DNA is the thing that directs the cell. If it's a eukaryotic cell, it's sitting in the nucleus and it's directing the rest of the cell. If it's a prokaryotic cell, like a bacteria, an archaebacteria or eubacteria, the DNA is in these little capsules. It's basically floating free on the inside of the cell. From there in class, we moved on a little bit. By the way, I have the books in the hand because you see DNA, it's even on the cover of our textbook right here. You see DNA going across it as a design. You see it all over the place. Again, we've all seen the structure a million times. You see it on every science book out there. And we are going to learn a little bit more about its structure and how it's put together. Finally, we moved on a little bit to talk. On the second half of the class, we talked a little bit about, we switched gears, and one of the things I love to talk about in class is the things in science that we don't yet know. You young scientists are the ones that are going to help us figure this out. And as we plow forward with science, your generation and the generations to follow are the ones that will pick up the mantle, that will say, okay, let's take what we know and try and apply it to the mysteries out there. In other words, one of the mysteries right now is we know the ingredients necessary for life. We know the atoms, the molecules that are needed to make life. But it's a little bit like making a cake and having all this stuff and pouring it onto your counter at home and saying, okay, cake, make itself. It's not going to happen, right? We still don't quite understand. We have some pretty good ideas, but we still don't quite understand how these molecules actually get together to make the first life, the first cell. Remember, cells being the basic unit of life. How did it come together? One of the very first things we did was we mixed some oil and water. And that's just some colored water right here. And we gave the example in class, and I'll hold it close to the screen, that when we mixed dye in the water earlier, we had a little bit of movement around. We tried to convince the class earlier this year that atoms and molecules existed and that they're always moving because of the Brownian motion, the constant movement of atoms and molecules. And we showed that with the dye moving through the water. Okay, that's all well and good, but then, hey, wait a second. I mixed some oil and water here. It didn't mix. So what's going on? Well, the molecules are still moving. Why aren't they mixing? There's some other force at work here. There's something else going on. Yeah, they're still moving, but there's one of those 4 fundamental forces of nature that we talked about right here going on. Electromagnetism, you might remember one of the 4 forces of nature: strong force, weak force, electromagnetism, and gravity. In other words, the little water molecules that we've already seen in class, those little ones that look like Mickey Mouse, they've got the plus side and the minus side to them, they tend to want to stick together. The Mickey Mouse molecule, water, tends to want to stick together. The fat, the lipids, the oil that we used here, that tends to want to stick together. They tend to stay separate. That being said, we think that this might be something that happened literally about 4 billion years ago on this planet that gave the early molecules of life a safe place, a place that they could be safe from drying out, a place where they could do their copying of what would be a forerunner of the DNA molecule, either the DNA molecule itself or RNA, which is like a half DNA molecule. We haven't talked much about it yet, just a tiny bit when we talked about viruses. So our experiment was meant to show when we mix the oil and the water that fat tends to form these little bubbles. These little lipids form these bubbles. And when these lipids form these bubbles, this might have given life a place to get a start. We had all the conditions just right here on Earth. We had the heavy elements that were made by stars billions of years ago. We had liquid water. We've got sunlight and energy from lightning coming together, we think, to make the first cells. We're not still quite sure how that happened, but this right here, the simple experiment, is meant to show that. Then we switched gears a little bit, and this was the part that was looking like homework, or was meant to be done for homework. And I'm going to grab a piece of paper over here and 2 dice and show you what we were doing. So it's just a piece of paper, a big sticky note. We took a line and we put the line from 2 all the way up to 12, and we took a couple of dice, and we were rolling them. And every time you roll the dice, for example, let's say, oh, I rolled a 7, I put a little X here along the 7. Oh, I roll an 8, I put an X here along the 8. I asked the students, this is what I'm asking you to do for homework, to do this at least 25 times. As you do it more and more times, you're going to start to see a very common distribution. It's called the normal distribution, actually, or a bell curve, pop up. And we see this in nature all the time. It goes kind of like this. And this, by the way, came up in our grade discussion with one of the classes the other day. This is often how grades are distributed when you give a test. Now, I did this very same experiment, and I did it on this sheet down, this little piece of whiteboard down here. And if you can see my distribution, I bring the camera down just a little bit. I've got from 2 to 12, I've got a big rise here, and then it drops on down here. I did this for a number of reasons. One, a little bit of statistics, how it relates to biology. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Two, you'll notice I had a big run of 9s right here. That was just some weird, like the more you do this, the more you realize it gets to be a smoother and smoother curve. An interesting thing here, because usually you have more 7s, 8s, not quite so high on the 9s. Remember, 7 is the easiest one to make. One other thing about the start of life and why we're doing something like this. This will come into class a lot. The normal distribution and curves like this, we're going to talk about it a lot, so I wanted to introduce it today. But one other little thing, and I'll show the pictures if I can on my notes when I put those out there. When I was doing these rolls of dice and I was getting them out and going, we had lots of 6s, 7s, obviously lots of 9s. I did not have a 2 for a long time. In other words, the only way you can roll a 2 with fair dice is a 1 and a 1, right? Didn't happen. Finally, I got a couple, right? You notice out of all these rolls here, each X represents a roll of dice. I only had 2 come up 3 times. The beginning of life might be a little bit like this. And what I mean by that is that if you have something that's not very probable, something that probably won't happen. For example, there's a game in casinos built on this, the game of craps, right? It's built on the idea that 7s come up the most often, 2s and 12s not that often. If you have something that doesn't happen very often, life might be a situation where you have all the molecules and all the things necessary to make life together, yet it's not just going to happen overnight. You have to give it lots and lots and lots of time. That's why we study geology and astronomy and all the other ologies in this class. That's why we study all the other sciences in this class, how it all comes together with biology. It may be that all the ingredients for life, you can have everything you need together. Yet life doesn't just happen just because you have everything there. It's like the cake isn't going to spontaneously make itself. You have to give it a lot of time and a lot of trials. In other words, each time you roll the dice, that's a trial. If you have all the chemicals necessary, if you have the right conditions, you have the right planet, you have liquid water, you have the energy from the sun and from lightning. If you give it a week, probably no life. Give it a month, 2 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, no life. But eventually, if you look at the tremendously long history of our planet, 4.5 billion years old, if you give the chemicals and the conditions the right amount of time, eventually, probably, we think that the molecules will get together and be able to make a copy of themselves. You'll have the right conditions for life. You just need to give it some time. That's where we're going with this. Really quick recap is that the most important, the concept of the day. I know we covered a lot of stuff. We're not going to see each other until next Wednesday, I believe it is. And remember, the concept of the day is DNA having the 4 bases, A, T, C's, and G's. A's always pair with T's, C's always pair with G's. And we will pick this up next week. Don't forget to get your vocabulary in. I will put the notes out there online, and we'll plow forward with our reading. We're going to spend a little bit more time with Chapter 2. Have a great weekend, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.